Hello, this is John Egan in Honolulu, and I'd like to briefly discuss the distinctions and similarities in the concepts of food security and nutrition. Food security and nutrition are really very closely connected. At the same time, they're also quite distinct. The agencies that deal with humanitarian responses for nutrition and food security tend to be different organizations. They tend to have different time frames, different points of view, and different procedures. Although there is a sense in which nutrition is a micro phenomenon and food security is a macro phenomenon, there's actually quite a lot more complexity involved. Very complicated in the sense that not only is it nutrition, but it also brings to the table questions of economics, questions of politics, even questions of weather and natural resource management, so many different things. And underlying all of this, we have come to understand that there's a fundamental basis in the human rights dynamic that also has to be considered. When we look at how the food security, nutrition, and food aid sector is laid out, we begin to see already how these are differentiated, whereas primary production, which is essentially an agricultural point of view, income employment, so we're talking about an economics point of view, general food security being a sort of population-wide phenomenon. And yet when we look at nutrition assessment and analysis, we're looking very much more closely at a lens going down to the individual. So these two concepts are clearly linked, but at the same time they're also very distinct. A place to begin is with the fundamental human rights point of view, that everyone has the right to adequate food, and there's a way of describing that, and you'll find these sort of definitions embedded into our human rights point of view. And this is really now, I think, become a fundamental touchstone of both food security and human nutrition. Food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food for a healthy and active life. This came to us from the World Food Summit in 1996. I think that we begin to have a particular human rights view, that food security is a perspective that gives us a clearer understanding of what our responsibilities are in providing people with the food that they need to have a successful life. There are many factors influencing food security, everything from seasonality to social structures, the nature of the disaster that has impacted the local population, what is the existing system of livelihoods, what kind of coping strategies are available to the population. These are all things that influence whether or not food security is going to be existing in a particular area or community. Amartya Sen, famous for winning the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on famines and deprivation, has famously given us a clearer picture of what's involved here. It isn't simply the natural phenomenon that cause people to become undernourished, but rather it has to do with their entitlements. What we can eat depends on what we're able to acquire. Bundles of commodities over which a person can establish their entitlement. And this becomes a clearer way of understanding how to address the problems of hunger, and very much so in times of disaster or health emergencies. Livelihoods, on the other hand, have to do with how we go about obtaining food, having to do with what we bring in terms of assets, our work, our material resources, and we begin to see that there are livelihood strategies that people use to go about their normal sustaining of food security, and coping strategies, which we hope to be temporary responses when food security takes over. Coping strategies, there are many of them, from the household level through the community level. People cut back on things, they engage in various types of behaviors that are detrimental to their long-term sustainability. These are the sort of things that we would hope that we can avoid by putting together appropriate and timely interventions. Malnutrition is a very much more focused phenomenon and encompasses a range of conditions. Acute malnutrition that we commonly see in extreme humanitarian assistance issues require very targeted responses, the food aid phenomenon, supplemental feeding, these kind of things. A minimum basic daily ration requires a minimum of 2,100 kilocalories per person per day. We know what people need, we know how to get the food to them, and yet it tends to be late and often inadequate. George Kent, a professor here at the University of Hawaii, has written extensively on this and makes very explicit the linkages between malnutrition and food security. He has given us a diagram that gives us a sort of comprehensive view of how food security and the lack of security is something that is really a social, political phenomenon put together by natural causes, results in malnutrition. And when he begins to lay this out in this type of a fashion, you begin to see how all of our interventions, whether they be at the level of the individual human with a malnutrition issue, or looking at the more large scale and more complicated issues of food security, they're all closely linked together. He also gives a schematic for how responsibility in food security is a nested series of circles from the very most vulnerable individual, the child, reaching through the family to the community, to the local government, state and national governments, and then out to international organizations at the outside ring. Essentially what he's suggesting here is that at any point from the inside circle where food security is breached and malnutrition becomes an issue, the next circle out should pick up that responsibility and do their duty to intervene in a successful way to stop malnutrition from spreading, getting worse. And this is a very interesting approach. Again, gives us some sense of how we approach picking up our duty as international humanitarian workers to work on the problem of food and nutrition.